Welcome back to the Restricted Handling Daily Intel Brief. This is what's been going on in Russia in the past 24 hours. Moscow is trying to change the political price of Ukraine's deep strike campaign by assigning responsibility directly to Britain. Russia's embassy in London warned of consequences after reports that British-made drones had been used against targets inside Russia. The British government did not confirm the reported use, but it reaffirmed that it will keep providing Ukraine with equipment. That distinction matters. A weapon can be built by a British company, supplied through a government program, modified by Ukraine, and targeted by Ukrainian forces. Moscow is compressing those separate steps into a claim of direct British involvement. The purpose is to make every supplier wonder whether support for Ukraine could bring cyber operations, sabotage, diplomatic retaliation, or another form of pressure against its own interests. Russia has made similar warnings before, so a statement is not proof that retaliation is coming. It does create a public justification Moscow can use later. Britain plans to deliver 150,000 drones by the end of this year under a package worth more than £750 million. The argument is therefore about an industrial system, not just a few aircraft. The fighting itself stayed intense. Russian officials said air defenses intercepted nearly 800 Ukrainian drones across 16 regions, including more than 150 around Moscow. Those figures cannot be independently verified and may include decoys or repeated tracks. They still show the burden of defending an enormous target set night after night. Russia also launched missiles into the Ukrainian village of Pechenihi in the Kharkiv region. Ukrainian authorities said 10 people were killed and 17 injured near homes, shops, a post office, and a cafe. Investigators said 2 small cruise missiles were probably used. The important shift is that both sides can rebuild long-range attack packages faster than defensive success can restore a sense of security. Russia's fuel system is giving us another measure of cumulative pressure. A tanker delivered about 68,000 metric tons of Indian gasoline to the Arctic port of Vitino after a ship-to-ship transfer near Port Said. The fuel is now moving by rail to domestic buyers. At least 2 more Indian cargoes are expected, while Russia is also using supplies from Belarus, Kazakhstan, and Asian diesel producers. One cargo does not mean a major oil producer has run out of fuel. It means repeated refinery disruption is expensive enough that importing finished product has become part of the stabilization plan. Export restrictions, emergency purchases, lower fuel standards, longer rail journeys, and priority allocation can keep the system working. They also move the cost into freight, prices, inventories, and uneven regional availability. That is a more useful way to read the refinery campaign than counting fires. The strategic question is whether Russia can keep military and essential civilian users supplied without sacrificing export earnings or producing politically damaging shortages. If Indian gasoline becomes a routine flow through several ports, we will know the balance has changed in a lasting way. The Kremlin is also narrowing the range of acceptable diagnosis inside Russia. Andrei Klepak left his job as chief economist at the State Development Bank after warning that Russia was losing a technological and economic war of attrition with the West. He also warned about dependence on China, inequality, infrastructure attacks, and the risk of a social crisis. The bank did not say why he left, so we cannot prove that the speech caused the dismissal. The sequence sends a message anyway. Officials can discuss adaptation and resilience, but describing the war as a losing national competition can end a senior career. That is dangerous for the state, because bad news does not disappear when the messenger does. It reaches decision-makers later and in a more distorted form. Cash withdrawals show how public fear is becoming a financing problem. Central bank data indicate that Russians withdrew about $3.4 billion during the first half of August, after $7.3 billion in July and more than $4.5 billion in June. Bank executives say the outflow is tightening liquidity, while businesses are also trying to move money away from regulators because they fear asset seizure. Rumors that the government could nationalize deposits are not confirmed, and one former central bank advisor judged that outcome unlikely. The measurable effect is that banks have less cash available to buy government bonds. The finance ministry canceled planned issues last month, even as the budget deficit climbed far above the forecast for the entire year. Domestic anxiety is now affecting one of Moscow's main channels for funding the war. The domestic political signal is even clearer in the case of Lev Schlossberg. The senior Yabloko politician received a sentence of 11 years and 1 month after condemning the war. In his closing statement, he called it a catastrophe for Russia, maintained his innocence, and repeated his demand for an immediate ceasefire. Schlossberg is today's daily courage selection because the action was concrete and the cost was known. He stayed, spoke in the state's courtroom, and used the proceeding against him to restate the position being punished. His sentence came as Russia's Supreme Court upheld the exclusion of Yabloko from the parliamentary election. That removes the country's only registered anti-war party from the federal ballot and eliminates one of the last legal ways to measure an organized ceasefire vote. There is another pressure line in the Pacific. Russia summoned Japan's ambassador after Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi criticized Vladimir Putin's visit to Iturup, one of the disputed islands Russia calls the Southern Kurils and Japan calls the Northern Territories. Moscow said its sovereignty was indisputable and reserved the right to take countermeasures because of Japanese sanctions and support for Ukraine. No countermeasure was specified, and the immediate military risk is limited. The strategic message is that Russia will connect separate disputes. Japanese policy on Ukraine can affect territorial talks, energy relations, diplomatic access, and the already distant prospect of a formal peace treaty. Watch 3 indicators now. First, whether Moscow moves from threats against Britain to an attributable action. Second, whether imported gasoline becomes a recurring program instead of emergency relief. Third, whether more candidates, technocrats, or party figures are removed after crossing the shrinking line around wartime criticism. Russia can still absorb major shocks. The leadership is increasingly doing that by importing resilience, widening external threats, and reducing internal argument. That's it for today's tour through the world's least relaxing headlines. If this was useful, leave a review or comment. For the deeper dive, head to restrictedhandling.substack.com. Stay sharp.